Hello and welcome to Q EDU 2021. We are super excited that you are here with us today. My name is Frederick. My pronouns are they and them. I am going to attempt to provide tech support and moderate the chat on our conversation today, but my internet is being very uncooperative. So if I fall off, I apologize. I will do my best to get back on. We have a fantastic presentation today from Shanae Adams. Shanae joined us last year for Q EDU and was so fantastic. We had to have Shanae back. So Shanae, if you want to check and make sure that your video and mic are working and see if we can do the screen share, if you're going to be doing a presentation, we can get all that stuff squared away and we can get started.
Hello, I am making sure that my Canva is going to cooperate with my life. Present. Cool. And then, okay, so that worked.
And do you have the share screen option?
I do have the share screen option. Okay.
My internet's not great. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off my video and mute myself, but I will do my best to be here if you need anything.
Sure. Are we, I see that in the room right now is us. Are we anticipating more people joining? Or I also see that this is being recorded. So kind of what's our vibes?
It is being recorded and will be available afterwards for folks. Like I said, my internet's really terrible at this point, so I don't know if Zoom is going to let me check the registration while I'm on this, but I can try and look. But yeah, I don't want to hold you up any. So if you want to get started, we can jump into it, and because it's being recorded, we'll have it for prosperity.
Sure. Okay. So what I will say is that I always like to make presentations to make sure that people are kind of getting the information that they want. And so I welcome like conversation and like questions and direct like kickbacks and everything within the presentation. But I do have something together. And so I'm just going to like start my spiel and just kind of start talking in a sense. But I did, I know the last time that I presented with y'all, there were some really, really great questions and we ended up having a really, really great conversation. And so I put this PowerPoint together kind of with that in mind. And so what I'll say is if you're watching this recording and you think of some questions, all the ways to get in contact with me will be on the very last slide. So please shoot me an email, a DM, all that jazz, so we can talk a little bit more about what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to share this. Cool. And I think we should be good. We can see this. Yeah. Thumbs up from someone. I'm just going to assume that we can see this.
Yep, looks great.
Cool. Okay, so I've been calling this workshop Power, Pleasure, and
yeah, it's good.
Cool. Been calling this workshop Power, Pleasure, and Relationships. And like I said, I'm really interested in making sure that people get the information that they're looking for. So I have put something together, and if at any time you have any questions, all the ways to get in contact with me are going to be on the very last slide. So this is me. My name is Shanae Adams. I run a sexuality education and consultation business known as Honestly Nay. I identify as a sexuality professional, which just means that I go out into the community and do different workshops, seminars, lectures about topics underneath the banner of sexuality. And I can fit damn near anything underneath that banner. So I call myself a sexuality professional. I'm also an entrepreneur in that Honestly Nay is a sexuality education and consultation business. And I also own a mental health private practice called My Therapeutic Services. My stands for Manifest, Affirm, and Intent. Excuse me. And those are the kind of principles that I always like to bring into my therapeutic space, but also my educational space. With Honestly Nay, our kind of tagline is that I'm here to provide melanated representation, normalization, and education. I am also a tantrika, which means that I practice the art of tantra. Tantra in itself has many terms and many labels. I think about it as just being very intentional. It's an intentionality practice that you can bring into any and everything in of your life. I also call myself a community minded thought in that I am the co-founder of a community resource center here in Colorado called the Chrysalis House. Chrysalises are the cocoons that caterpillars go into and they emerge as butterflies. And the process is literally the caterpillar turning into goo, and then they emerge with these beautiful wings that they can't even see. So at the Chrysalis House, we always like to tell people you are more than welcome to turn into goo here, and we will affirm you of your beautiful wings, of the things that you have done and can do when sometimes they're not super present in your eyesight or in your mind right then and there. And I also identify as a pleasure activist. And so today's we're talking about power dynamics. I had to pull from, how I most often see power dynamics kind of like in my day to day. And a lot of that work stems from the work that I do as a professional dominatrix. So this is my dom persona. Their name is Sire. They are a sensual, sadist, bratty vampire. And I'm also a kink and fetish practitioner and facilitator. So I teach people how to engage in kink, how to engage in power dynamics in a way that feels safe and consensual, and in a way that is ultimately pleasurable. And as we kind of talk about that word pleasurable, all of the workshops that I do, all of the education that I provide, everything that I kind of build my life on, I like to stack it on 4 principles called sex positivity. And I know that sex positivity is a bit of a buzzword and it kind of gets thrown around a lot. And that's why I always like to make sure that folks in my presentations know that as I'm conceptualizing my workshops, as I'm bringing you this information, and definitely how we're going to be talking about power dynamics is going to come from a lens and a viewpoint of sex positivity. And there are 4 pillars of sex positivity for me. And the first pillar is that all humans are sexual creatures. All humans are sexual creatures, and what that means is that we engage in sex and sexuality inherently because we are sexual creatures. So we see, young humans that masturbate in the womb. We see young humans who engage in self pleasure as a soothing tool, as a coping tool. And if we come from the standpoint that all humans are inherently sexual creatures, that means that nothing that we do that can be described as sexual is bad because that is naturally who we are and how we move. And if we're coming at humans with the understanding that we are all sexual creatures, it takes a lot of the stigma, it takes a lot of the taboo, it takes a lot of the hush hush off of these experiences that we're having and these things that we're doing. That leads me to the second pillar is that everyone has sexual experiences. And this is something important to highlight when we're talking about relationships is that everyone has sexual experiences. Everyone is navigating and playing within their own sexuality. And when you come together with your partner or partners, you get the opportunity to participate in kind of like a Venn diagram of sexuality with the two of you kind of lining up in the middle. And so, if we're understanding that everyone has sexual experiences, it's important to note that not all of these experiences are positive, but they are valid and they are true. Sometimes there's this desire to have an understanding of people, to understand how and why people move the way that they move. And sometimes that understanding comes off as demanding that people kind of back up or support or validate their experience. They have to prove to you that their experience is their experience. And if we come with an understanding that not everyone has positive experiences, not everyone is having the exact same experiences, but everyone's experiences are valid and true, then we move out of this place of having to understand, but into this place of accepting that these are the things that are happening to people. Excuse me. Now, acceptance doesn't mean that you agree. Acceptance doesn't mean that it's the way that you want to live through your life as well. But acceptance does mean that that person's experience is valid and it's true. And they don't have to defend or back up their experience to you because it's valid and it's true. Excuse me. All right. And the fourth pillar is that everything in life, including sex, should be motivated by achieving pleasure and not doing harm to others. So when we talk about getting into relationships, when we talk about playing in power dynamics, there can be a lot of different factors that go into whether or not a person desires to be in this relationship or they consent to being in this relationship. And if we're coming at it from pleasure, that you should get into relationships because being in this relationship brings you pleasure, being with this human brings you pleasure, being with these people gives you pleasure, and you're not trying to do harm to them or to yourself. Now we get to be motivated by something that can't be manipulated because we're seeking to achieve pleasure. Now, when I say everything in life, I also speak to, the work that you're engaging in and the friends that you have and the spaces that you're finding yourself in. And as I say that, I do want to acknowledge that the ability and capacity to engage in pleasure can be somewhat thought of as a privilege. Not everybody has the privilege to work in the place that they would like or to have the kind of job that they want or to not work so that way they can dedicate more time and their energy to the pursuit of pleasure, right? But when we look at these four pillars of sexuality, especially things being motivated by pleasure, what this is a call to action to look at what are some of the places in your life where you can prioritize your pleasure. What are some of the places in your life that you can start to ritualize your pleasure so that way you beget more pleasure? And as I'm saying this word, I want to point out that pleasure is not inherently sexual. I would actually argue that non sexual forms of pleasure are actually more important than the sexual forms because the non sexual types of pleasure are the pleasure that we get the opportunity to ritualize. We get the opportunity to be very intentional about making sure we do something that brings us pleasure. We eat something that gives us pleasure. We look at something, we hear something, we smell something, we taste something that's giving us pleasure. And it's through utilizing our senses in the ritualization of that pleasure that we then get to beget more pleasure. So let's get into a little bit of kind of power dynamics. And like I said, my standpoint of power dynamics comes from operating within the kinky world and the kinky and BDSM world. And so I'm not going to go super into what kink and BDSM is because that's a whole different workshop that I would love to give to you. Please shoot me some information if that's something that you're interested in exploring. But when we talk about kink and BDSM, there's a certain level of power dynamics that can come into play. So typically in the kinky world, there are three different identities, there are three different roles, there are three different jobs that can exist in the space. And when we talk about these jobs and these roles, there is a certain transfer of control, energy, attention that's moving in these roles. So in the role of the dominant is typically on the receiving end of control, energy, and attention. When we look at the role or the job of switch, they are sometimes receiving or they are sometimes giving away that control, energy, and attention. And when we look at the role of the submissive, they are typically giving away their power, their control, and the attention. And there are a variety of different power dynamics that exist in the kink world. Some, for instance, are things like animal play, which is where one person might be pretending to be in a submissive animal role, and there might be a person in a dominant owner or trainer role, such as our puppy play or our pony play. There's age play where someone might be giving away their power and filling the space of being a person of a younger age, and someone might be of an older age. There's race play where one person might be giving away their power and their energy because of their race, and the other person is in reception of it because of their race. Psychological domination, where one person might be welcoming you to enter their mind, and the other person is invading their mind, as well as consensual fetishization, which is sometimes thought to be worship, where one person is giving their power and attention to the person that they are worshiping, and that person is in reception of it. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the different kind of kink power dynamics that exist, but these are kind of the top five that I see in a lot of the spaces that I inhabit. Now, like I said, we're not in this workshop today to talk about kink in any way, but I do want to point out that power dynamics are not necessary for kink play. It is definitely possible to have kink play in these kind of to have kink play without engaging in power dynamics. But as we continue along this same kind of structure of what power dynamics look like in kinky relationships, there are a lot of rules and regulations. There are kind of boundaries and statutes that are put in place when we're engaging in kink power dynamics to help keep people safe. And the first thing that we're seeing that helps to keep people safe engaging in a power dynamic are consent modules or consent models. So when engaging in kinky play spaces, there's a kind of general foundation that people are consenting to the play that's going on, to the type of relationship that's happening or that's taking place. And there are several kink consent models that exist right now. The first is safe, sane, and consensual, where there's a lot of subjectivity about what it means to be safe and what it means to be sane. And so we've progressed to RAC, which stands for risk aware consensual kink, where now we're looking at, if we enter into this power dynamic, what are the risks that are involved? And how are we going to make sure that we are consenting whilst being aware of the risks that are involved? From RAC, we've progressed into PRIC, which is personal responsibility informed consensual kink. And what PRIC does is it now makes it your personal responsibility to be informed about the power dynamic that's about to be in play. It makes it your responsibility to ask questions and do research and feel comfortable and confident with what the activities are that you are about to get into. It makes the responsibility on y'all as individuals, on y'all as a group, to talk about what's the information that we need to make sure that we're engaging in this relationship dynamic as safe and as pleasurable as possible. And one thing that we're seeing now with COVID-19 is RAVE, which stands for Risk Aware Virus Exposure. And RAVE actually was created during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, in that people wanted to be aware of their virus exposure. And so we're having these conversations about, if I'm giving you my energy, my power, my control, my attention, what are maybe some of the things that my body needs to be prepared for? How am I going to keep myself healthy and safe whilst engaging in this power dynamic? And we're seeing those same things now during COVID-19, where people are having conversations about their virus exposure, asking if people have been tested, if they've been vaccinated. And hopefully, this opens up more doors for us to be able to have conversations about sexually transmitted infections with a little less awkwardness and a little more ease, since we've been able to engage in these virus exposure conversations in our day-to-day lives due to the panorama that we're in right now. When we talk about kink power dynamics, there's also a very high level of communication that is taking place to make sure that everyone is feeling safe and taken care of whilst engaging in these activities. So, the first kind of communication we see, even before people start to get into that play, is scene negotiation. Now, negotiation does not mean I want to do these activities and you don't. So let me convince you to do these activities. Seeing negotiation means sitting down and asking very intentional questions about what's going on with the people you're about to play with. How is your mental status? Have you done the human things? Have you eaten? Have you drank water? Asking questions about the activities that you're going to get into. What exactly are we doing? What tools are we using? What are you going to be wearing? Is anybody going to be watching? Can your body do these things? Do you have the mobility or the ability to be able to engage in these activities? We talk a lot in scene negotiation about, are there any things about your past that I should be aware of? So that in no way means, we're asking people to give us a chronological breakdown of their trauma, but we are asking, is there any way I shouldn't touch you? Is there anything I shouldn't call you? Is there any situation that you're not wanting to experience right now. When we talk about communication in kink play, we also talk about having communication during the scene. So, how are we going to communicate with each other that everything's good or that we need to stop or that something is not feeling good? And we talk about, are we going to be able to communicate this verbally? And what are some non-verbal cues that we should be looking out for so we can make sure that whilst you're engaging in this power dynamic, even though you might not be able to say something verbally, your body might have some information to tell us. And so, what should I be looking out for as a person receiving the power, the control, and attention, or even as the person giving the power and control and attention? What are some things that I should be paying attention to that your body might be trying to communicate to me that maybe your mouth might not be able to? We also talk about aftercare in kink power dynamics. How are we going to make sure that after we get done playing, that you go out into the world equal to or better than you came into this environment? We never want to send people out into the world worse than. We always want them equal to or better than when they leave playing with us. And sometimes people don't know what their aftercare looks like. Sometimes that's an additional adventure for everyone involved to be able to explore together. And so, as I talk about kind of the things that we have in place when it comes to kinky relationships, excuse me, those things lend themselves to power dynamics in in our romantic relationships as well. And so, what I want to do is do a little bit of exploration and a little bit of pulling together about, seeing how there are very structured tools in place to help protect us when we engage in kink power dynamics. What are the ways that we can be aware of and protect ourselves when we're engaging in romantic power dynamics as well? So when we talk about the different kind of roles that exist in our relationships in the world, in society, there are far more than three, right? What you see in front of you right now is something called an identity wheel. And identities can be thought of as the hats we wear, the jobs we do, the roles we play, the lenses through which we view our world and through which the world views us. And these identities kind of stack on top of themselves like lenses in a kaleidoscope. So if you think about the identity that you hold, it's possible that you might share identities with other people. But the nuance comes from the other identities that you also hold. So, for example, I identify as a queer Black femme. And there are several other queer Black femmes in the world, right? But because of our gender expression, because of our mental ability, because of our citizenship status, because of our marital status, because of our work experience, even though we share this collection of identities, our realities can still potentially look extremely different because of the other identities that we hold. And when we study the intersection, when we study the experience at existing at the intersection of several identities and several minority identities in particular, that is something called intersectionality. And I bill myself as an intersectional kinkster in that I believe it's really important that we look at the identities that people are having when they're coming into our spaces. And in this instance, the space that we're talking about is our relationships. So the identities that you're having impact how you might communicate in your relationship, impact what your relationship might look like, impact what your needs might be in a relationship. And coming at things from kind of an identity standpoint gives you and your partner the opportunity to look at those intersectionalities and talk about the nuance that comes up from existing at those intersections. So, as we hold this identity wheel in general, there are societal impacts that come with existing with certain identities. And typically we think of those impacts as isms or systems of power. And so when we think, whenever you see the word ism, I always tell people that you want to link it back to a system of power. So racism is a system of power in which folks of a particular race have the most power. And as we talk about these systems of power, these isms, they can definitely show up in the power dynamics that we're having in relationships and also in the power dynamics that exist in kinky dynamics as well. And I always like to tell people that sometimes we're not even fully aware of how isms and our intersectionalities are impacting us until we get into the systems. For example, I have clients who identify as Black or as people of color who might have consented to engaging in a play scene with a white person or who might be in a romantic relationship with a white person. And so when we look at the systems of power in which whiteness is prioritized, and those are the people who are given the most power, and we look at what people of color and Black people and Black women in particular, and Black femmes in particular, have been taught about existing in this system, is the idea that they don't get to speak up. Right? The things that they need and want are not prioritized. And so I might have a client who's finding themselves in a relationship with a white person and finding that speaking up for their needs is difficult, finding that while they care and love about this person, there are just certain instances and events that are coming up that are having huge impacts on them because of the fact that they exist in a system of power in which, in our society at least, those in power are white people. When we see the word sexism, this is a system of power based on sex in which male bodied people have the power. And so it's possible that a woman who's in a relationship with a man person is finding themselves being kind of swept up by the patriarchy, wondering why they don't feel seen, wondering why they're experiencing difficulty and being heard. And so when we move out of that like super pinpoint, when we expand our lens to look at the systems of power that kind of govern our society, it makes a lot of sense that if you're a person raised to believe that you're supposed to be seen and not heard, raised to believe that your needs and your wants are not to be valued, raised to believe that you are the best due to whatever you do, raised to believe that you automatically get to start at a certain point and that people should just adhere and believe and respect your starting point. It makes sense that there could be some tension or some things arising in those relationships because of the systems of power that are in place. Ableism is a system of power based on ability, where those in power are the mentally and the physically abled. Those in power are the ones who don't have to worry about accessibility and going to dinner. And so now you might be a person who is differently abled, who can't go to the restaurant your partner wants to take you to. And so now maybe you feel ashamed or you feel guilty or you feel like you're ruining the night because this place isn't accessible for you. And when you expand the system of power, it sucks that this is what's coming up in the relationship and it doesn't hit you kind of until it hits you. Heteronormativism is a system of power in which heterosexuality and heterosexual relationships are thought to be in power, and all those who are not in those kinds of relationships are kind of not in power or oppressed in a way. So this is kind of looking at the tax breaks and the government benefits that were once given to heterosexual couples in marriage. This is even having to do with especially if we pull ableism into this as well, is that for certain Medicaids and government forms of health insurance, people are not allowed to get married and keep their insurance, right? Because able-bodied heterosexual marriages are is what is prized. I see a lot of this come up for my clients who are in heterosexual appearing relationships. So this could be bisexual people or pansexual people who are in a relationship with a person of the opposite gender or the opposite sex. Even for, some of my transgender clients who, might appear one way but fully are in queer relationships, but there's, benefits that are given to them or disadvantages that are given to them because of what their relationship appears to be like, and that can lend itself to some of the difficulty that might come up in relationships. Ageism is a system of power related to age, in which primarily the population of people 35 to about 60 are in power. But can you even think about how it might be to be in a relationship with someone who's older than you? That person has more experience, that person has more resources, that person might have more money, might have a better job, might have all of these different things that go into being a person of the majority or the power majority age in our society. And to feel like, you as a young person or you as a younger person, maybe you don't feel like you have as much to contribute to the relationship. Maybe you feel like, the financial split of the relationship yields you being very dependent on this person. And so now you don't want to advocate for yourself or speak up for your needs because you don't want your partner to take away the financial support, or you're afraid that they're going to take away that financial support, or you're afraid that there's just going to be some kind of negative outcome that's going to come, and that can definitely impact how you move through relationships. Classism. Classism speaks to a system of power in which those who have knowledge and money and opportunity are in power. So class doesn't just speak to kind of like a caste system of like the higher ups and the have-nots. It definitely can pull in like your SDS status, so where you are in society, how much money you make, and the demographics that you hold. But class also speaks to what you know and who you know. So if you're a person who, it very much makes me think of like, if you know what fork to use when you go to a fancy dinner, that is a form of class, that is a form of knowledge that can separate, one person from another. And sizeism is a system of power in which those who are of smaller size are the ones in power compared to folks who are of a bigger body. I know I see a lot of femmes in particular, but I do have some mask people who come because they feel like because of their size or because of their appearance, they have to take what's given to them. They're not allowed to pursue relationships that might actually be pleasurable to them, or pursue partners or people that are going to treat them the way that they desire to be treated because of their size or because of their appearance and how they look and how they kind of move through the world. And so when we're talking about power dynamics that exist in our relationships, a lot of those can stem from the power dynamics that exist of being in society and the power dynamics that exist from having the different identities that we have. So, one of the first things that I always like to do with my new couples who are coming in, my groups, my thruples, folks who are coming in who are talking about concerns that are arising because of the different identities that they hold, is I always like to do a little bit of identity processing with them. And all processing means is that there's questions that I ask for them to explore with themselves and explore together. Because, like we saw in our kink power dynamics, there is a lot of explicit conversation happening that is the general norm. There's several models and a lot of research that has gone into what are the best models for safely engaging in kink. And, sometimes in relationships, we don't get those explicit conversations, we don't get those explicit models of how do we talk about how we're showing up in our relationships. And so, a good place to start is with the identity exploration conversations. So, what I'm going to encourage you to do is go back and forth between the identity wheel and these identity questions. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of questions, just as like this is by no means an exhaustive list of identities that exist. But this is definitely a good place to get you started, to start to create. Excuse me, I'm doing all of the human things today, y'all. This is definitely a good place to start to have explicit conversation about what's showing up in our relationships. Okay. So I always ask people to separate from your partner or partners and answer these questions alone. And then let's come back together and talk a little bit about our answers and a little bit about this process and having some time and opportunity to have that explicit conversation with each other. So what identities are most important to you? What are the roles that you play most important to you? What identities are the most important to your partner or partners? What identities impact your ability to show up in relationships and to show up fully? The same way we talked about, if you feel like because you are of a certain size, you don't get to show up fully in your relationship because you have to take what's given to you, because you only make so much money or you only know so much about which forks to use during fancy dinners. That impacts how you're able to show up in your relationship. What identities do you think impact how your partner shows up in relationships? And also how they're navigating through societal isms as well. It could be interesting to think about, how does my partner, who maybe falls in the majority of the identities that are in power, how does it feel for them to move through the world? Versus how it might feel for me to move through the world. And keep in mind that just because you might share, the same race identity or the same financial identity, that it's those other identity that creates nuance in our experience. What, if any, barriers do you run into because of your identities? The same way we talked about accessibility. Is it possible for us to plan, a spontaneous getaway? Do we have to be worried about whether or not, my partner's going to be able to sit in the chair? Does my partner have a certain ability that is going to make it difficult for them to do the things that they want to do? How do you navigate those barriers? And how can you support others that have identities that differ from you? And how do you support your partner as they're navigating through the barriers that can come from having different identities? Another question that I think it's really important that I ask my couples is, how comfortable are you naming your differences of identity? In your relationship, have you ever sat down and had an explicit conversation of, this is me and these are my identities and this is how it feels like to be me and this is how I move through the world, and here's you and here are your identities and here's how it feels like for you to move through the world. And it's important that when you have this conversation that there's not blame, right? No one chose the identities that we have. No one decided that they were going to look this way or that they were going to have a body respond this way, right? And at that same time, it's important to note that you can both be oppressed and be the oppressor. And as I say that, what I always like to tell people is sometimes when I've hosted parties or when I've hosted activities or events, the fact that I am able bodied gets in the way of my ableism, right? I know what it feels like to move through the world with my body. And I also acknowledge that not everybody has my body. And so, I can make as many allowances and have as many thoughts as possible about how someone else with a different body is going to be able to access this event. But I don't know. The only person's experience that I will ever truly know is my own. And so that means like having to name that this is my identity, and I acknowledge that other folks have other identities. And so, what are your accessibility needs? How can I help to make sure that you're able to come and participate? What I think is really interesting is when we talk about naming the differences of identity, is that kids do that all the time, right? Young humans are real good for walking into a place and being like, whoa, there's 3 Black people in here, 2 white people in here, and a person of Asian descent in here, and there's like 5 old people in here and 5 young people in here. And we sometimes get groomed as humans in this society, a society in which, we're taught to push things under the rug, or the idea that naming identities is somehow rude. What do we tell those young humans? We say, hey, it's not cool to call out people's races in public, right? But imagine what would happen if we affirm that kid that, like, whoa, look at you. There's a lot of different people out in the world, and some of these differences you can see, and some of these differences you can't see, right? Because we have visible and we have non-visible identities. And so, as we see all these different places, all these different identities and these different people in this place, what's something that might be important for us to keep in mind so that everyone in here feels safe and feels welcome? How are those people whose identities are different than yours, what might their experience be like? How can you help show up for them? Instead of shaming and coming at this, not seeing all of our identities. I'm alluding to this idea of like not seeing race. When you don't see people's races, when you don't see people's abilities, you don't see them. And so, how comfortable are you naming your differences of identity? And not only naming the differences of identity, but celebrating the fact that people have different knowledge than you have. Celebrating the fact that people have different experiences, and all of those experiences are valid and true, and no one has to prove or defend their experience. Even looking at what are the societal impacts on your relationship. How might it feel to be a partner who leaves the home to work and a partner who's a stay at home spouse? What are your different energy levels looking like? What are the different contributions to the household looking like? What might it look like to be folks coming from different cultures and attempting to have a relationship together? What is society's views on our cultures? Are there any, for example, like anti-Blackness things perpetuated in your culture? And what are you doing, especially if you come from a culture that has some anti-Black tendencies? What are you doing as a person from that culture to support your Black partner in perhaps? So really looking at, what are the societal impacts that are showing up for us? I always like to tell people that not everything that's happening to you is happening to you. And that might mean that it's happened to your ancestors. It might mean that it's happening to people who look like you. And so you're feeling those residual impacts as well. Those things can definitely pop up in our relationships and as we're trying to explore and navigate in our relationships. So I would definitely encourage you to take this as like a journaling prompt, as some shadow working prompt to start to explore within yourself. So as we move from identities and we talk about power dynamics, Gottman's, who is a relationship psychologist, says that there are 4 horsemen that designate the relationship apocalypse, or the 4 horsemen of that kind of contribute to folks' relationships not being healthy, not being successful, and ultimately maybe being on the path to not existing. And power dynamics can definitely play a role in all of these different horsemen. So the first horseman is criticism, which is verbally attacking personality or character. And this can be, talking about how, you are a stay-at-home parent, and you don't clean the house, and you don't work as hard as I work, or you're young, you don't have the experience that I have, or you don't share my racial identity, so you have no idea what it feels like for me to be able to move through the world like this. And so when we're talking about that criticism, using those I statements is what's super important to diffuse that criticism. So again, that's, I am hearing, or I am feeling, or this is what I am seeing, because I can only view this experience through my lenses. You can only view your experience through your lenses. When we talk about the horseman of contempt, it's attacking the sense of self with an intent to insult or abuse. So a power dynamic of intent might be, well, I know more than you. So, I didn't want to ask you what you were thinking or what you were feeling because of the privilege that I have of being of this particular identity. And so the way that we battle that horseman is by bringing a culture of appreciation. So even though we have different identities, even though we're viewing the world through different lenses, there's information and knowledge that you have because of your identities that I don't because of mine. And so you want to affirm those positive qualities and find gratitude for those positive actions that you're seeing your partner contribute to your partner or partners contribute to the relationship with. The next horseman is defensiveness. So victimizing yourself to ward off a perceived attack and reverse the blame. So this might be, you're yelling at me because you think that just because you're a man, you're able to do blah blah blah. Or just because you have more money or more resources than me, you think that you get to do blah blah blah. Victimizing yourself as opposed to accepting your partner's perspective, accepting the fact that your partner's experience is valid and is true and might be completely different than yours. I meet with couples who will tell me their perception of the exact same event, and it can be wholly different because of the way they're perceiving this event, because of the identities that they're having. And so, instead of being defensive and saying, like, well, you just don't understand where I'm coming from, that's your opportunity to explain that this is how my brain works. This is how I see things. This is how I view things, and accepting that you might have very different perspectives. And now there's the opportunity to pull your perspective and their perspectives and find that Venn diagram of intersection and take responsibility for what's coming up for you and how. The last horseman is stonewalling, which is withdrawing to avoid conflict and convey disapproval, distance, and separation. And stonewalling can be like, you just don't get me. I don't know how else to tell you. You're just actively not trying to understand me, so I don't want to talk to you anymore. Right? And that power dynamic can definitely come up, especially if you are, in more of a position to be able to isolate, or if you're leaving a partner who needs, a little bit more emotional care and a little bit emotional support to fend for themselves. Can you imagine the damage that not talking to that person could do to your relationship? So we always like to say you want to take breaks. You want to spend time apart. It's perfectly okay in a conversation with anybody to say, "Hey, I need a minute. Let's come back around to this." But the point of that is to make sure that you come back around to it. I've met a lot of people who will say, things got heated in our conversation. And so we decided to take a break. And then we just never came back around to it. So you have to make the commitment to come back and have the difficult discussions. But it is perfectly possible to take a break, to separate, to re regulate your emotions. So that way you are able to show up in this environment and have a conversation. And so, as we're talking about preventing the four horsemen of apocalypse, of relationship apocalypse, this is really just an activity of intimacy building. As we're holding, exploring our own identities and our partner's identities. Now we get the opportunity to come together and start to build on our intimacy. And intimacy is defined as a close familiarity or friendship, a cozy atmosphere, or an intimate act, especially sexual intercourse. And while I like this as a good blanket kind of definition, intimacy is so much more than that. I always like to tell people that intimacy is into me, see. So look at me, witness me, bear witness to my experience, understand how and where I'm coming from. And if we hold that as our definition, we can actually break intimacy up into several different categories or several different forms of intimacy. And there are about 12 to 15, depending on the literature that you read. But I have found that definitely in terms of trying to give people an overview and especially in kind of like relationship building, that these are the top 6 forms of intimacy that can be really helpful to help get really solidified. And then you're able to move over into the remaining 6 to 8 forms of intimacy as your relationship is starting to grow closer and glow, grow closer and grow. And so, as we talk about intimacy building, this is all conversation. And so, for each of these intimacy categories, I'm going to be giving you some prompts that are some questions to ask yourself. Maybe these are more journal prompts that you can sit down and explore with yourself, but questions that you get to ask to your partner to help explore y'all's intimacy and help to think about the power dynamics that are showing up and also getting ahead of those power dynamics before they start to conjure up or manifest those horsemen of of relationship apocalypse. So, social intimacy is how you bond through play. So, asking questions like, what is your style of play? What's your perfect date? And bonus points if you say April 24th, because it's not too hot and not too cold. All you need is a light sweater, right? What inside jokes do you share? And how can we spend time apart that honors and allows us to show up authentically? Even thinking about what are the identities that you have that contribute to the styles of play that you have? What identities are important to show care and appreciation to that we can start to honor and prioritize in our date nights? Um, Really looking at how we bond through play, because in relationships you get a play partner, you get a buddy who you get to be able, or buddies who you get to be able to go out or stay in and explore and play with. Next is emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy is how you hold space. And so when we think about how our identities might contribute to how we hold space, this can look like, what kind of family did you grow up in? How was in emotional intelligence taught to you as a child? What's your ability to regulate your emotions? Getting into, do you know the difference between empathy and sympathy? Are you able to use I statements? Are you able to be vulnerable with yourself and also with your partner or partners? What's your apology language? What do you need to feel seen, loved, and cared? What identities of yours are maybe like demanding more energy, more attention, and more care from yourself? And how can I, as your partner or your partners, show up? What does support look like for you, and how are you supporting others? And I always like to ask people, sometimes the most difficult question within emotional intimacy is, how are you feeling for real? Like actual. And asking this question with intent, but also listening and thinking about, what are the identities or the experiences that this person might have had that's contributing to these feelings. Next is spiritual intimacy. Spiritual intimacy is how you connect. So what is your faith, which is another identity? What are your values? What are those identities? What do you do um, every day to try to be better than the day before? What is your kind of commitment to growth in a sense? What activities can you bring with a partner to bring y'all together spiritually? What are some of the ways that we can start to interlace our values? How can we support each other in hitting and achieving our values? You might even ask, when do you feel the most in tune with yourself? And even on that same standpoint, I like to ask people, when do you feel most othered? When do you feel most outside of the group, or most disconnected, or most alone? And are there any identities that you hold that contribute to that disconnect or that aloneness? How do you ground yourself in those moments when you do feel disconnected? What motivates you to be a good partner, to be a good friend, to be a good child, to be a good employee? What contributes to the desire to get up and show out? Intellectual intimacy is how you understand. So, what are the important topics in your life that you're learning about? You know, Identity intelligence can definitely be an important factor. How important is it for you, for your partner to know about the identities that you hold? And in particular, the identities that you hold that might be different from them. How do you know when a person gets you? How does it feel to be seen and fully understood? Is there any media that y'all can consume together that you're bonding over, or any media that you've consumed that has shaped how you view yourself, how you view relationships, how you show up? Physical intimacy is the role that sensation plays in our intimacy. So, thinking about how important is touch? Do you have relationship rituals? Do you have secret handshakes or coordinated dance breaks? And even as we think about, indigenized cultures and indigenized practices, those contribute to how we view touch and what we need, how we're starting to build our relationship, how we might build our families, how to interact with each other's family, right? If you come from a super touchy family and maybe they don't, where's the boundaries that exists in being able to have this physical intimacy? For now in the pandemic, we talk about, is it possible to have physical intimacy? What are those questions that we need to be asking and those understandings that we might need to be having to engage in that physical intimacy? How do you soothe yourself when you can't have touch? And are there any substitutions? Can we amp up other intimacies if physical intimacy is not accessible or not desired? Last is sexual intimacy, which I like to say is a culmination of all other intimacies. So thinking about, how do you define sex? And this can stem from your identities. What were you taught about sex growing up? What's your understanding or your kind of conceptualization of yourself as a sexual creature? How important is it for sex to happen in this relationship? Are you having conversations about your feelings, about safety, about protection? And sure, physical safety, physical protection, right? But emotional, that emotional safety, that emotional protection, that spiritual safety, that spiritual protection. Are there other intimacies that you're willing to engage in, that impact how willing you are to engage in sexual intimacy? What are those identities that are engaging in this sexual intimacy dance? Are there things that, for your sexy time, are there gender things that you need to be amping up, or things that you want to be dampening down? Are there identities that will be more visible to your partner? And how are those feeling for you to think about possibly being in a sexual space with somebody? And then more thinking about, how sexuality and sexual intimacy is impacted during the pandemic. And even for folks who are in relationships, there I've seen a lot of couples who have had changes of sexual intimacy because of the other identities that they may hold, right? Or we might be dealing with some mental things because of the pandemic, or we might be dealing with some physical body scares, some health things. Is sexual intimacy even possible when we're in this heightened state of emotional heightenedness? And how does sexual intimacy serve you? How does it serve your relationships? What is its value? If it has any, maybe it doesn't. And there's another identity for you to start to explore in terms of those power dynamics. If one partner is asexual and not interested in having sex, and another partner is of a different orientation and interested in having sex, where's the Venn diagram intersection between that? How do those power dynamics play? What other identities might impact how your sexual orientation grows or moves through the relationship? And as we are exploring intimacy, I always think it's important for people to kind of sit down and think about, what are those thoughts about intimacy? Is that something that you've heard before? Is that something that you want to pass on and explore with partners? And again, how is it going to look different if and when the pandemic ends? how does it look now during the pandemic? And so here's the point in which I would offer opportunity for questions. I know that we have always had a lot of great conversations. And so, I'm going to encourage y'all to, I encourage who's in the room if they have any questions. But like I said, if y'all are watching this recording and you have some questions, please shoot me an email. Please shoot me some DM messages. And let's kind of get into what's coming up and how things are resonating for you.
Thank you so much, Shanae. I have learned so much. I feel like in such a short period of time. My question is, are we going to have the privilege of having the slides? Because there's so much wonderful information in there. I would love to be able to post those on the Q EDU website.
Sure, I can go ahead and shoot these slides over. Yeah, I can shoot this PowerPoint over.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That would be wonderful.
For sure. And so here's all of the different ways that you are able
to
find me. So my website is honestlynae.com. That is the best way to keep in touch with what I'm doing and where I'm doing. There is where you're going to be able to find all of the workshops and events that I'm doing. I also have Honestly Nae swag, so you should definitely go check out the swag. mytherapeuticservices.com is my mental health private practice. I will say that I am launching supportive and group therapies this fall. I will have a queer lineals group, which is basically just like queer millennials, where we'll be able to do some resource building and some toolbox building while the sun is out, because when the sun starts going down earlier is typically when I see a lot of people starting to have a lot more mental health struggles, just because it gets darker a lot faster. So let's build up our toolboxes while the sun is a resource for us, so that way you're prepared if and when things start to go left. Here are my social media handles, and I also have a YouTube channel, which is Honest Sex with Honestly Nae. If I get enough questions and such, I could potentially post a video to get all of those things answered. But if I've said anything that feels like it could be of use to you, please reach out. So let me know. Like I said, I'm a community-minded thought, so let me know what community is needing, and we can kind of go from there.
Thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure. Again, yeah, I've learned so much. And we love having you at Q EDU. We're super excited for the sessions we're going to have next week as well. Monday is a session for parents. It's using your powers for good, how parents can affect change on school campuses. Tuesday, we're having an intergenerational chat between bisexual men. Thursday of next week is our regional GSA coalition panel featuring all of our student leaders across Texas. And then on Friday, I'll be leading a session talking about finding inclusive professional development for educators. So we've got a lot of good stuff coming up next week. We hope you will join us for that. And again, Shanae, thank you so much for being here with us. We super appreciate you. The pleasure has been mine.
For sure. Yes, please bring me back out of doing workshops for y'all.
Thanks so much. Have a good one, y'all.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.